Yeah. Well, let me tell you what you're in for today. These calls, so this week, I mean, technically the Coors show ended on Sunday. But because there isn't a physical Coors show, we thought, well, let's keep things going and let's keep talking. And so this week, what we decided to do is have kind of a different type of talk. And if you've been in the calls since Friday, we started again. If you've been in on those calls, then you know that they're really kind of different because what we're doing is digging a little bit deeper into some concepts and what's underneath the work. I'm really excited about this one too, because this is something that I find really like I'm stepping into kind of uncharted territory, or I feel like I kind of guard myself a little bit in these situations when I start to talk about intention behind the artist's work. And so in order to do that, I spend a lot of time talking with the artist and getting permission, really. And so these two artists that we are going to have on today, if we can get Ron on board, otherwise it's just going to be me and Sophy. I know he's here somewhere. But these two artists that we have today in particular, I may talk more to Sophy and Ron than I do to almost any artist. And so there's a lot of intention behind this work, and that is certainly not to minimize any other artists out there. But I think as far as artists in the Coors show and artists whose work you see out there, I think quite possibly theirs is the maybe hardest to understand and often kind of confronts some of the more difficult topics that artists and art can talk about and deal with and process. So last night, Sophy, you and I were having this great conversation about intention and where we wanted to go with a conversation. And you remembered a rainy day in London, and you popped into, to get out of the rain, Christie's. And
that's right.
Yeah.
It was Christie's, and they were having their auction was up to be seen, and it was sporting paintings. Mm-hmm. And there was this, and I went in, and there were a couple of Munnings, but there was this one in particular, yeah, which was painted when he was with the cavalry, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, on the front lines in the First World War. And there were millions of horses in that war, and they were used for not only for they were used for hauling. They were often underfed. They were wounded, and they died in shocking numbers. And this little watercolor, which is beautiful, I think, is of the sick line. The horses that have been put up for injury or whatever, and it just made me think. It was Alfred Munnings is so good at horses. He's so perfect in his mm-hmm. rendering, and he seems to have, he has such insight into them and their body language and everything. But this little painting made me think of things that were not, that were not pleasant to think of.
Yeah.
And but I could think of them when looking at this.
Ron, what we started talking about is we started talking about artists confronting some difficult subject matter. And so in this painting that Sophy is sharing here with us and we started talking about is talking about really difficult topics. And so Sophy, Munnings actually went to the front. He was there and painted. He did a lot of paintings, and this was World War I believe. Yes?
Yes, it was World War I, and he went with the Canadian Cavalry Brigade and went to the front. He also went with the Forestry Commission, where they were, clearing paths and and building as was necessary for the war. And he took 3 stretchers and a lot of canvas, and he was there for some time. And the paintings that he I think he delivered like 24 paintings to the government as a sort of record of the war. And they're at the Canadian War Museum. And they are, I think they're very beautiful. And there's, he could capture, a troop of trace-clipped horses slogging through grey mud and in France, and you just you feel like you're there because he was there.
Sophy, are you guys seeing just the painting on your screen?
I'm seeing the painting. I can see going up there.
You can see that stuff? Can you see the chat box open? And having the weirdest time with, okay, but you see the painting, and so...
It's a lovely painting, and it stayed with me for years. I mean, I think it was 2002 that I saw it, and it just stayed with me. I'm surprised we found it online, because it's a tiny little watercolor, obviously in private collection and not part of the part of the body of work, the final body of work.
And when we were looking at this last night, and I meant to double check this, but I was mentioning that I believe it was Thoreau who went to the Civil War front, and his brother was in the war, and then the papers would list the dead and the wounded, and they saw someone with the brother's name listed in the ranks of the wounded or dead, and but they didn't know, and so he traveled to the battle sites to try and find his brother, and it turned out his brother was alive, and so while he was there, Thoreau realized that he really could be of service to the men in the Civil War, and he tended, he was like a nurse's aide. He wrote letters home because a lot of men were illiterate, but the war had a terrible toll on him, and he died at a rather young age. It was very stressful for him, but he realized the importance of letters and poetry in his art form in really talking about the realities of war and not glorifying it. And I think, to kind of bring it back to what art can do, and when some really important aspects of art are when we talk about these important social issues that are happening in our world as they're happening, you know. And so Munnings did this and so beautifully. And I think that's the incredible thing about when artists do this kind of thing, is they draw us in, and then you realize that this painting is the sick line, and that these horses are all really probably, at the time he was painting them, not long for the world, and were in very bad shape, right?
Overworked and underfed.
Right.
And you know, and yet willingly doing. I mean, that's the amazing thing about horses. They willingly do these things for human beings while being totally themselves.
Right. Right.
But I think that.
And
you know,
just
if art is something that is, you know, if you make things because you have something inside you that is that you want to express in some sort of refractive way, or you know, it's a sort of synthesis, if you like, of your experience, and life is not always, you know, pretty.
And so, you know what, let me toss this to you, Ron, because this is a conversation you and I have had many, many times about what's going on in your work. And so it's kind of something that I think you and Sophy at about the same time had these revelations in your life. For various reasons, and I'm going to go back to our screen share again, I'm going to call up this painting still, and I hope everyone can see it. And then Sophy, we're going to go back to the piece going. But this painting still, Ron, has a lot of significance to it, and I'm wondering if you would mind talking about that. And when did you do this? This is about 2 years old, this painting?
Yeah, it's like a year and a half to 2 years old, I would say. Yes. Speaking of the difficulty of, getting things out, and it's hard for me to, speak for anyone else's experience and how they sort of process things. But for me, a lot of the things that I've had, happen to me in my past have been stewing inside my heart, soul, mind, spirit forever. And there's this thing that happens, and again, speaking from for me as an artist, that, always wanted to kind of deal with some of these things, but never really felt I had the time or the opportunity to do it. Yeah. And so if I could take you back a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about this painting and a little bit about where it came from. I was profiled pretty much from I would say 14 or actually even earlier than that, I would estimate, all the way up until I was probably in my mid to late 40s.
Wow. And profiled as a Black man.
Yes.
Black youth and Black man in Denver and in Ohio.
Yes, and Aurora, and not much was different, in the in those jurisdictions. If you were pulled over, now for me, I've never done anything, never been incarcerated. Always tried to, abide by the law, but yet I would get pulled over, and I would do these things such as you fit description of, and there was usually no explanation, or you have a warrant out for your arrest. And, I would do things as simple as saying, well, what do you mean? How can I have a warrant out for my arrest if I haven't done it? And of course there's no, they just, I've been handcuffed, placed in the back of the car, guns drawn, tackled in the street, all of those things, and only to be let go. And there's no apology, no explanation, just, well, we have to check these things out. And so still for me is sort of like this, even though I think that in the character of what I'm doing with some of my shapes and expression of those shapes in my paintings, a lot of these things I deal with it because I'm constantly thinking about these things. But still sort of represents one of those moments, where where I was in the street, with my hands up, and there's, they're on this big megaphone, and then I hear these feet running towards me, and I'm thinking, okay, what's going to go on here? And all of a sudden, I'm tackled in the street. Just before that, my son was in the car, and he was wondering if I was going to get shot. Yeah. So a lot of these experiences sort of actually are suppressed because when I would go to court, and sort of challenge some of these things that was happening to me, I would only get, the judges saying things like, well, why would our officers lie? And then the cases would be dismissed. So pretty soon it was one of those things where it's like, why do I even say anything? Because it doesn't do any good. So I would suppress a lot of these things. And many of these things were happening right before some of my art shows and things of that nature, but I would just tuck them away. And I don't know if that's necessarily a great way to deal with things, but it's just a reality.
Right. And so, for both of you, and I really think, I mean, if I can go so far as to say this, is that I think like the treatment of your work and what is coming out, what we see on the surface is really very striking, gorgeous images, and challenging images in some cases, but underneath the surface is a lot of emotion that is being processed through this, through your painting. And, it's kind of an interesting thing, I think, Ron, you and I have talked a lot, and Sophy, we've talked really a lot and very intensely about the act of painting and how things come out as you're doing it. And in fact, I'm going to pull up this painting going for Sophy. And I think this is a good time to kind of talk about this one as well. In that this was a painting that you had, Sophy. It's I want to say it's 96-ish square.
Yes, it's about 8 foot by 8 foot, I think. And it was completely finished in a completely different way. It had a red and yellow wall, and it had ground, and it was, there was detail in the haunches. The horse had 4 legs at one point. It was totally different, and my life fell apart quite radically. Yeah. And I experienced loss of family members, and I was suddenly in a whole different world, and I didn't really know how to proceed in terms of life, let alone life as a painter. But it was something that could not be ignored, because it was my whole life that had changed. And so, and I was actually very angry with painting, because painting is a kind of solitary endeavor, and it takes you away from your life in part, and so I felt very angry at it, and I didn't paint for a while. And when I came back, there was this great big painting. The only reason it didn't get thrown out with a lot of other stuff was because it was at the studio and not by the dumpster. But I was angry at it. I was angry when I got back into the studio, because I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know whether to do even. And I threw things at it, and I scribbled on it, and I spray painted on it. I think, I wrote on it, I destroyed it essentially.
Yeah.
And bits of it never got rebuilt again.
And that's
and it
kind of
became something else, which was that was, which is a sort of it was a metaphor for what had happened.
and that painting, I remember when we hung that in the Coors show, this 3 years ago now, right? Yeah. You could see the paint dripping off of it. You could see almost the violence of the things you threw at it and went at that painting with, like just taking out your emotions on that big canvas.
It was. I mean, it was expressionistic in that way. It was quite a thing to paint. And things getting lost. I never looked again at the source material for it. I had a lot of photographs of this horse and rider, but they, I couldn't do anything like I did it before.
Yeah.
So I never looked again, which is part of the reason, so things it's just sort of, there was a lot about memory because I was trying to remember. I mean, the horse has a blue ear.
Yeah.
And a line where there was a sort of three-dimensional haunch, or it became also about trying to remember, which is what I spent a lot of time trying to do. I was trying to, I spend a lot of time remembering what was, and so it sort of was metaphorical in that way too.
Yeah.
It came about memory and losing it, and not remembering the things that you want to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could not remember, for example, the lower left-hand corner of the painting was completely obliterated.
Wow.
And, I was like trying to remember that fourth leg and I just couldn't. So it's not there.
Wow.
It became about memory, which I was thinking of.
And Sophie, I'm going to click onto the Picador's horse. This was also from that year. Oh, good. Ron's back. Hey, and I just want to say, if you have questions or comments, everyone who's out there listening, I will click back and forth because I'm not seeing the comments pop up on my screen for whatever reason. But please just know I will come back out of the share and try and check in on your comments and get your questions answered. But I want to move to the Picador's horse. And I want to talk about this idea of expressing emotion in your work in subtle and not so subtle ways, right? And this painting to me, I just remember, actually, I'm just going to say that you both have done works of art that I cannot afford, and they are burned in my memory, and I desperately wish I could have purchased those pieces of art. I think even this year, Ron, you had a painting that it sold, and I was like, good thing, because it was I could have never bought it. And this painting sold. And Sophie, this is one that really haunts me to this day, that I wish I could have added to my collection. It's so poignant. And I'm wondering if you would talk about this. This painting came about when you got back into your studio, what, a year and a half or so after all
Yes.
this trauma?
Yeah. I had been to Mexico, and the picador's horse. The horses, they're kind of used as the red rag to the bull, and they're very padded, and they have layers of felt padding and sort of armor. And at the same time, they have their ears. They have their earplugs, and are blindfolded. So they don't know what is. They're sort of protected, and they are deprived of their senses. And I come back to these horses all the time because I felt myself like I was, not seeing and not prepared for what was coming.
Yeah.
And there's something about that amount of body armor. I mean, it makes you feel. It's recently made me think of, our lawmakers going out and buying bulletproof vests. But when you can't see, and you're blindfolded, or you can't hear, you're very aware of your internal. You're more aware of your internal life. So that also spoke to me.
Yeah.
That feeling of having everything thrown back to the inside of your mind.
And there's so many metaphorical layers to this painting as well. And this is something I'd really like to talk about, because with your work and with Ron's work in particular, and you both work very differently in the studio. I'm fairly familiar with both of your practices in the studio, and you both come about things very differently. But there is so much meaning and metaphor within the work. And this one, that orange color, so orange and blue are these really lovely complements. But in this case, that orange has a much deeper meaning, if I'm remembering this correctly.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because people see different things in the orange. To me, orange is a color of alarm and emergency.
Yeah.
But it's also, this particular orange is also, people have said to me it's a Tibetan orange. which was interesting to me, because it is quite, it does have a lot of that that Indian yellow in it.
Yeah.
And,
wow.
but yeah, and the fact that the horse is blindfolded and doesn't know. But I find colours to be so personal and emblematically personal to people that people see different things, and what you put into a painting is going to be, it's not sort of, the painting is not complete until other people see it and bring their own they remake it with their own with their mind, and it's and I think paintings, how individuals see. I mean, it's it completes the circuit, if you see what I mean. When other people see it, and people see different things.
And we had that crazy conversation with that woman who emailed the National Western to say that she thought your paintings were glorifying the abuse of horses, which was, and I'm going to pull up another one of your pieces right here called Street. Okay, and that really threw me for a loop because I didn't see abuse, and you and I were talking about it, and I responded to this woman explaining what was behind the work. And if any of you've read my blog on this, it's on my website, rosefrederick.com, Misunderstanding Art. But I responded to her and I gave her a lot of insight, and her response back was, well, I guess we're just going to have to agree to disagree what is art and what is glorifying abusive animals. And I was like, no, agree to disagree. That's not happening here. And so it was just this very strange thing that, and this is the thing I think in both of your works, is that there's so much power and emotion to it that people cannot walk past it quietly or kind of brush it off easily. Like, I think it gets under the skin of a lot of people. And Sophie, weren't you saying that you even have friends of yours who have a hard time with some of your recent work?
Yeah, and some of the older work too, the bucking horses. So where there's a lot of, it's all about fight, and it's about, to me, it's a sort of physical manifestation of a sort of a fight.
Yeah.
Wow. And they're responding in a very adrenaline fueled way. Mm-hmm. And some people have a hard time looking at that.
Right. Wow. And it's interesting because they're just not able to divorce themselves from the subject in a way.
Right.
So Ron, this is a painting that was recently purchased by a museum on the East Coast. And it's called Yoked. And this painting, this is a good sized painting. I had the dimensions. It's about 40 by, I can't remember.
I can't remember, but it's just somewhere in that 40 by 48 range. I'd have to look it up real quick here to get the exact dimensions, but
I can look it up too. But yeah, talk about this painting, because this painting came about the last summer, really, and the riots were going on. A lot of Black Lives Matter. A lot of things were exploding across the country, and we had a number of conversations about that, and you saying that you're not a violent person ever. You don't agree with the violence, but you do see, you feel this uprising. You feel this because of everything that's happened to you and your brother and your friends and your family, and this painting emerged out of that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how it came out.
Yes, I think during the course of the summer, we were having a number of things, and when these things pop up, because I am who I am and what I've dealt with, they sort of resonate with me. Some similar things, and some have gone far and beyond anything that I've actually experienced. And I think when I started this piece, and what I've been doing with a lot of my pieces lately, is I really just start by making some marks, or laying down passages on the canvas, and kind of waiting for the canvas to tell me what to do. So during this particular time, I was not only was I seeing some of these things that were happening in the public's eye. I was also doing some research on the civil rights movement, and I think that a little bit of that sort of shown us this particular painting, but it ended up towards these three women, of color, and I think I was responding to And I don't know if it was, a lot of the strong women that I've had, pour into my life, like my mother, my wife, aunts, you name it. There have been a number of them that have sort of kept me on the right path. And so, when I was, going through this whole, things that we were seeing in the summer and, and looking at some of the old marches from the civil rights movement, I started to see that, back then, there was like this collective togetherness that, a lot of the people shared, and they were protesting in a peaceful way and, for a cause. So the part that I do kind of understand with what's happening in today, or recent events, I should say, is, the need to, have a voice or, have people hear your heart. And as I mentioned earlier, I've experienced that, well, it doesn't matter what you say, it's what, if people actually hear you. And so, I was thinking about how they marched together, and some of them even were met with violence and things of that nature, and they still, continue to, press towards this cause. So this painting sort of reminded me of, the whole idea of Yoked, reminded me of this togetherness, but not in the negative sense of, what you would see with like an animal, being contained or restrained, but more this togetherness and solidarity and pushing together for one cause. So that was really the gist for what happened with this painting as I continued to work through it.
Yeah. So something you just said right there, and I'm going to stop the share for a second and see if we have any people asking questions. Something that you said right there is this idea of putting stuff out into the world and having this conversation with the world about what's going on, right? And for you, a lot of what you're working through is a kind of PTSD from being profiled. And Sophy, your PTSD is a very internal loss. And I'm wondering, in having these conversations, I know that there's such a great value in having that having the conversation. And with the two of you, you're visual, you're painters, and the conversations come out on your canvases. And I'm wondering, Sophy and Ram, when you're talking about, when you're processing, when your voice is speaking through this work, how important is it for people to respond back? Sophy, do you know how to?
Did you want me to take that one? Or?
Yeah, either one of you.
Do you want to go, Ron, and I'll follow?
Oh, okay. So I would say what's more important is that I actually deal with it myself. And I think that for a while, when things, I was allowing things to be, to keep them on the inside and make them very internal. It was just me trying to just say, I'm sweeping it under the rug. I'm not going to deal with it. So there's that aspect. But I do think that in order to affect some sort of change or have, you have to have a conversation. Because I've talked to many people that I know, and especially when I tell them about some of the things that I've experienced, and it gets really deep, they are in awe and can't believe. It's like, wait a minute. And that's, this does happen to me. So I think that we have to have these conversations so that everyone, becomes more aware. And what I was, what impressed me about this, this dynamic is how many people either, and I don't know if it's selective or, if people just don't, know, but I find it, in this day and age, especially with, the technology that we have, that, a lot of these things would still happen without having some sort of, awareness of what's going on. So we have to have these conversations because it's in front of our faces. So I do think it's important to get that out.
Right. Right.
And have the conversation.
Sophie, well, both of you, and Lacey Ballet has put in our chat, the raw emotion and vulnerability that Sophie and Ron share on canvas is amazing. I'm lucky to have Blinded too. And every single time I view it, the emotion grabs me. I have another piece of Sophie's from 2008, Untitled Bucking Horse, and visually can see the emotional change between the two. Priceless. Thank you for sharing this discussion today. Love it. Thank you for that. And Hannah Lichtenfels writes, this is so enlightening and personal. Thank you for opening up and sharing with us. I have grown from the exposure. Thank you, Sophie, Ron, and Rose. I'm going to go back to thank you, Hannah, for that. I'm going to go back to our screen share here. Just take a look at a couple more pieces. And when we're talking about the interpretation of your work and how people see it, this one was in the show last year, I think, Ron, right? Veiled?
Yes.
And this one, I put this in our grouping today because this one really spoke to me. And there was so much about this right here, this area where you covered her eye. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me, Sophie, of the picador's horse and the blindfolded horses, that your subject is being deprived of something. And I think it's probably fair to say that most, if not all of your work, both of you are portraits, self-portraits to some extent. And so I'm wondering, Ron, if you would touch on this, and then there's a piece that Sophie bought out of that show that I'd love for you to talk about.
Yes, because and both of them, they were created around the same time, so they're actually connected. And the title of the next one coming up, speaks to a little bit of that. But this whole idea of the Shadow of Innocence. So I can start here and then move back to Veil.
And this is the painting Sophie. That struck Sophie. And so I almost want to kind of turn it over to the two of you to really talk about, because I think this is the perfect circle of, you created a work and turned it out in the world, and Sophie walked past this and had this connection with you, but a connection to something deep inside. And it's this interpretation. So yeah, let's talk about this one.
So for me, first and foremost, with all of my art or the things that I put out, I've come to this conclusion that I really want people to experience it and have whatever that experience is. Because, for me to completely control exactly how someone views my art or how they should, to dictate what they should feel, I think it's just not my place. And as a matter of fact, it's a place that I don't, personally believe, helps, my heart and soul. I feel as though you put this work out into the world, people are able to, do with it however they want to, and even though we might interpret things a certain way ourselves, the reality is when it's not in front of our faces, or someone that doesn't have the knowledge of where it came from and what the intent was, they respond to it in whatever way that they respond to it. So this particular painting, Shadow of Innocence, it just kind of took me back to this, when we're born, and I'll go back to my childhood a little bit with this. I had a number of friends, of every race, and we would play together, we would talk together, have fun. There was no differences. So this whole idea of like bias or racism or anything that any hang up you might have are most often just learned behaviors. There's things that people, bring in. So this whole idea of this Shadow of Innocence, it's just this painting just reminded me of, how we are without all of those layers or things that cause us to, think a certain way or do a certain thing. And then what that the byproduct of that is. And that's when I go back to Veiled, which kind of speaks to this this seeing in also versus seeing out. You know, it's hard to get in to see someone, and it's hard to see outside of things when you have like these barriers. So when I did, you know, place that piece over the eye, it was just my my response. So people interpret this very, very differently, you know, and it just depends on, you know, your vantage point, which I'm completely okay with. But it reminds me of me wanting to speak out, wanting to say things, but can't get past the things that are in front of me. And it reminds me of people from responding to me only based off of, you know, the knowledge they may have, or some of the things they've, you know, been taught over the years, but not really truly getting to know me or understand exactly how I feel about things. And I'll stretch that out to how other people feel, because in order for you to understand me, I have to understand you, no matter where we are on the playing field. So I think these are both kind of connected to one another in some sort of way.
And is there, so I'm going to go back to this and Sophie, and is there a responsibility to the viewer to, you know, I think responsibility might be kind of strong, but it's sort of what I want to say. Is there a responsibility to the viewer to come with an open mind and an open heart, and to be willing to listen when they look at art? Or, I mean, we can't control that, but you know what, I would just say that. And there is a responsibility to the viewer, whatever you're looking at. And, you know, and these are the things that carry the stories of our time, right? And so, Sophie, I'm wondering, this painting, you had to have this painting. And I remember you thinking about it and talking about it and finally buying it from the show. And I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about that understanding for yourself.
Absolutely. I did have to have it. And can I first say, I absolutely agree with Ron that you don't own the meaning of what you make. And that you know, it's interpreted, you know, its job is really to spark imagination in, you know, for other people, I think. And I think the responsibility, you know, is to as a viewer, is to yourself. This painting spoke to me, and when I read the wall tag, that was the clincher for me. When I look at it, which I do every day, I am reminded of my children, and I saw their innocence drop away overnight, and it seems to capture a moment in between innocence, which I feel, which I get from a sort of slackness in the, you know, sort of in the face. In the face, there's a sort of unconscious, you know, not conscious of the muscle in the jaw, something like that. I see, but I see this moment of when innocence falls away, and the black square over the ear I see as not wanting to hear things that have suddenly become apparent in the world, that the world is not that great a place sometimes, you know, and can be ugly. And the shadow, I mean, everything about this painting, I love the form that the hair makes. It makes a literal, you know, literal shadow. And I just see that moment in between knowing and not knowing. It reminds me of my children. It reminds me of me, and it reminds me of my son particularly. And there's something haunted in just haunted by knowledge. And then, and as Ron was saying, there's the black square particularly is a sort of blockage blockage between this internal and external life in there, life behind the eyes. And I love that piece of, I love the bits of colour that are there. It means a lot to me, this painting. I see it every day and think about it every day.
So we are actually at the 1 o'clock hour. This went really fast. And I've enjoyed every moment of this. And what I'm going to do is just a second, stop the share, see if there are other questions or comments that people have. I think people are just really consumed by this conversation as we have been. And so I want to thank you both. And I also I'd like to end with a comment from each of you. And I know we're not supposed to do this, is like wish other people would do something or, try and change somebody else. But I'm wondering if you would end with, in a perfect world, when you put your work out there, what would be this thing that you would want to happen? And like, I think what happened just right here with Sophy talking about your work and how she's taken it into herself. And I'm wondering just what that is for an artist, because I don't have that. Like, I'm not a painter and I don't know what that is like to put your work out there and have people buy it or walk past it. So thoughts?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Do you want me to go for it?
I would say
Sophy, go for it.
To me, it's one hopes that there is enough that it just triggers the imagination in somebody and triggers, that it triggers that it's open enough for them to bring their own meaning, and I trust in the process that you make these things, and I trust that something, if you're truthful when you're making them, and it comes from the place in an authentic manner, then something that is hard to describe does communicate. It's a form of communication. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more about just your own time and place and your own experience, and it becomes the sort of condensed thing that can trigger the imagination in somebody. And thank you, Ron, for your painting. I love it.
Ron, how about you? What would be your...
I appreciate the words, because exactly what you said, especially when you were talking about the painting, is what I feel should happen with anything that I do, is to open up dialogue. And first and foremost, Sophie, I agree with you as well. And you actually took the words out of my mouth. I just want to paint my truth and get to that. And it might take, the rest of my life in order to do that, or feel comfortable with letting go enough to where I can do that. But each painting that I put out, I just want to make sure that I put my best foot forward, and I'm not painting in a pretentious way. And then that work, wherever it goes, whoever should experience it should have their own relationship with that, and glean something from it, and that could be good or bad, because I think that it goes both ways. You can't put something else and just think that it's going to be all rosy. Sometimes it's not, but it's a response. It opens dialogue, and that's what I think painting should do. It's not for us to hoard, and keep to ourselves. I think that we are given a gift, and we should It's not saying that everyone that is an artist will do that, but it's just my thought. I think that you're given a gift and you should share that gift.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay, well, we didn't even get through all the slides I had. I knew that was going to happen, though. One final comment here from Christoph Stoneman. Thanks to all three of you. This was great, and I gained a lot of insight and found it very inspiring. You two inspire me so much. Christoph, that's the perfect way to say it, is I am personally surrounded by art and literature, and it's every day I walk past works of art, and they pick up my soul. They inform me. It's when you're talking to people about collecting something that can't drive you to somewhere or take you on a vacation, or what is it that art does? And I think it does fill the soul. It feeds the soul, right? And it's that connection. So I want to thank you both so very much. One, for being on this Zoom. Two, for, I'm just going to say it, for trusting it in me as a curator and sending me the work that you do to the Coors show, because it's so personal. And I think there's a trust for all of us, for artists and curators and an audience, is that to trust that the work can live and be seen without prejudice. And, you don't have to like everything, but at least, it can have a safe place, and a conversation can happen if the people want to have that conversation with it. So I want to thank you for that trust, and for your caring and everything you do too. So we are over time, and as usual, any final words? And I want to thank you again. And Patricia, thank you. Art evokes emotion. Thanks for sharing your stories. I agree 100%. All right. I am going to end it, and unless you have any final words, and I appreciate it. Love you all so very much. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.